I'm currently serving as the PSU-AAUP president, and thank you so much for coming today. If you're not familiar with what we do here at PSU, we represent around 1,100 faculty and academic professionals here at PSU, and it's a collective of elected volunteer leaders who make our organization what it is. So I really would just like to take a moment to acknowledge those of you who are in the room who are active with PSU-AAUP. You're on the executive council, the collective bargaining team, the organizing committee, unit representatives, and or any PSU-AAUP members who serve on any committees on behalf of our organization. If you feel comfortable making yourself known, now is the time we'd like to thank you. I know who you are. Thank you all. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize our PSU-AAUP staff. So Debbie, in the back of the room, Debbie Herman, Heather Namias, our administrative director. Debbie's our executive director for membership, organizing, and communications. And Brian Lally, where did you go? Brian Lally, our executive director for contract enforcement and bargaining. Thank you so much. We couldn't do this work without our staff. So why are we here today? My favorite two-word phrase, shared governance. We talk about it a lot at PSU, and especially recently when it seems that the university seems to forget that it exists. Yet it's a core tenet of our higher education values and our organizational structure, and it's under attack across the country. So today we have a national expert with us on shared governance, and my hope is that after her talk, PSU, this is only a part of a much longer and deeper conversation about shared governance on our campus, rather than it being like a going away party. For shared governance. Not why we're here. So on August 1st, Dr. Ann Cudd will begin her presidency at PSU. So let's take what we learn here today into our welcoming and into our ongoing dialogue with her as our new university president. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Julie Schmid. Julie Schmid, in addition to being a wonderful human being, is the executive director of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, a position that she's held for a decade. Prior to taking this position, she served as chief of staff for the American Federation of Teachers, Wisconsin, where she worked on the University of Wisconsin organizing campaign. From 2014 to 2016, she was an affiliate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Wisconsin Center for the Advancement of Post-Secondary Education. She has been involved in higher education advocacy for 25 years and holds a PhD in English from the University of Iowa. Let's welcome Julie.
Thank you, Emily, for that great introduction. And I just wanted to thank the Executive Council and Emily for their invitation to come and speak, and thank the PSU-AAUP staff as well for the hospitality. And a special shout out to Debbie Herman, who I've known for, what, Debbie, 30 years? It's been that old, Julie. I know, it's been impressive. And also I just wanted to say hello to people in the room, some of whom I recognize from my time here as chapter coordinator from 2000 to 2003, so that dates me, you can do the math. Before I start my talk, since we're talking about today's shared governance and ways that faculty get to exercise power collectively in their institution, I want to take just a brief minute to publicly congratulate the Faculty Alliance of Miami at the University of Miami in Ohio, an AAUP-AFT union that won their election today 450 to 241. So I just want to ask you to join me in sending a big congratulations out to the universe. I know they are partying down in Oxford, so I have a feeling they'll hear you. So, I always feel like it's like the minute or the time in It's a Wonderful Life where the bell rings. It's like an 18 minutes rings every time the faculty unionizes. And it's exciting there because they were trying to organize a very broad unit. The administration fought that, and the librarians were hived off into a second union, and their election's coming up like in the next couple of weeks, and I'm pretty sure, but I'm not going to jinx them. Anyhow, let's move on. All right, so I'm here to talk to you about unionization, shared governance, and reclaiming the common good. And I'm going to admit, I've kind of reworked this talk over the past few days as I've had the opportunity to be at PSU again and talk to friends here, new friends, old friends. And as I mentioned, I used to work here 20 years ago, and I'm amazed how some of the same challenges are still facing the institution and how some of the same discourse around austerity is still playing out for different reasons, but it's still here. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about AAUP and the notion of the common good. I'm going to do a little foray into neoliberalism in higher education, just because I like talking about that. And then we're going to come back to what does it look like to reclaim the higher good and sort of how shared governance threads into that. All right, so just a little bit about higher education and the common good. And this is, I like talking about this stuff because it really gets at both why AAUP was founded and what makes higher education in the United States distinct. So AAUP's 1915 declaration defines higher education in service of the common good the following way, right? They say that it promotes inquiry and advance the sum of human knowledge, provide general instruction to the students, and develop experts for various branches of public service. I think it's important to remember that this notion of higher education as a common good or a public good is an idea that comes out of the progressive era, right? This is deeply embedded in progressive era thinking. It's first articulated by AAUP's founders in 1915, actually January 1915, I think it comes. And they're articulating this at a time when higher education in the United States is evolving from being either denominational, right, a place where you would go to be trained as a clergy member, or proprietary, really, you know, for lack of a better term, training to be in business or training in law, right? So this notion of the common good and another AAUP, shall we say, professional standard, right? Academic freedom derives from this sort of understanding of higher education. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me at this time is really, AAUP is not only articulating what the common good is, they're articulating what academic freedom is at this time. They borrow heavily from German higher education, which I won't say the words in German because I know them, but I can't speak German, so it's not terrible. But it's really the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn in German higher education. The AAUP's concept of academic freedom extends beyond that German definition to include public speech as well, right? And there's a reason for that, because if higher ed is embedded in the common good, this is part of it. So, just a little bit about that. So here's how you guys define the common good at Portland State, right? Much more succinct than the description I just gave. And my kids would really yell at me for the picture, but good thing I'm not here. All right, so For AAUP, shared governance and unions are really vehicles for ensuring that higher education serves the common good, right? They're a means to an end, not the end themselves. Shared governance, unions are ways of exercising collective faculty voice. This quote from our 2005 Statement on Academic Unionism is an attempt to articulate that vision. Another way I've heard it articulated that I really like is something that AAUP's General Counsel Lisa Lieberwitz said in a speech she gave about 5 years ago that I was at, where she defined it as shared governance as the public and collective articulation of academic freedom. So I like that too. For AAUP, unions and shared governance are mutually reinforcing institutions. So really, when you think about it, the unionism and the struggle for meaningful shared governance are linked from the beginning. I have a quote from AAUP's Statement on Collective Bargaining, which came out in 1973 here, because it talks about that. Also, I mean, you have language in your collective bargaining agreement that does the same thing. So I just want to reference that. And like I said, it's really important to remember that these things have been linked from the beginning. Again, they're tools that go together. AAUP's Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, basically our shared governance statement, came out in 1966. That's also the year of the first faculty strike, which was at St. John's on Long Island. And that was, they struck over academic freedom violations. It's followed up by the strike at Catholic University of all places. You know that institution. And that strike was in 1967, and it was in response to Charles Curran being fired. He actually spoke out on abortion rights, and turns out the Catholic Church didn't really like those. So he was fired without due process. The faculty struck over it. And the same year, 1967, the first AAUP collective bargaining union chapter organized, and that was at Belleville Area Community College, which is now called Southwest Community College in Illinois. So these things have always been together. They've been twins, they've been linked. Just another quote that kind of articulates that relationship and really tries to, I think, get at something that Stanley Aronowitz describes in The Knowledge Factory, which is the faculty's collective attempt to maintain sovereignty over the curriculum. So again, AAUP keeps kind of working this through our discourse. I'm going to talk a little bit about this picture, just because this is a picture from 2018. It is the Wright State AAUP chapter strike, which at the time ended up being was the longest public higher ed strike in the country. I think the Temple grads have been beat now, but what's this happened? A lot of them haven't since then. One of the things that was, you can see they struck in the middle of winter. I was there. It was really miserable. Some days it snowed, some days it rained. Some days it was just freezing cold. It was, but these people were on the line. It was amazing. One of the reasons they struck, so this is a unit that is composed of tenure-line faculty and non-tenure track faculty in one union. In Ohio, part-time faculty are excluded, actually forbidden from being able to organize for collective bargaining. They're not just excluded from the act, they're forbidden. One of the reasons this group of faculty went out on strike was that in their contract, they had job security language for non-tenure track faculty, which for all intents and purposes gave them tenure. The administration was trying to claw that back at the table because they had gotten themselves into a bit of a financial mess. It was what we call an own goal in soccer. The board was engaged in some crazy real estate dealings, and it just turned into a mess. It impacted the institution's financial position, as they say, and the administration and the board decided to try to balance the budget on the faculty, and specifically the non-tenure track faculty. Hence the strike. All right, so we've kind of been nibbling around the edges with the discussion of right state, but I wanted to move into a discussion of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism has impacted this notion of the common good in higher education. So I have this quote. I'm not going to read it to you because you all know how to read. But I like this quote from Henry Giroux because it so clearly captures what it means to move away from the idea of a common good, of a shared endeavor, right? Something we're all committed to together. And I think he does a really good job also of really, how do I put this? Capturing the neoliberal ideology, he calls it a public pedagogy, which I understand to mean we're all so interpolated into it that it's sometimes hard to step outside of it. He compares it to feudalism. It's just sort of this totalizing system that way. So, you know, for higher education, right, what this has meant is really a radical restructuring of higher education and moving away, like I said, from this notion of public good. This is a project that started, 30, 35 years ago. We've seen how it's played out in higher education. There's sort of three markers, I suppose, of that. One is the shifting of the burden, right? The cost of higher education, shifting from the state. Again, shifting away from this idea of higher education as a common good, something that we all want to invest in because we understand its importance to the functioning of the polity, right? Shifting away from that to a more consumerist model where it's a privilege, not a right, right? And if you can afford it, you can get it. If you can't afford it, you can, go into incredible debt. Those are your options. The other marker of it is this shift away from job security for those who teach and research in higher education to a more precarious model, right? So those are the things we see happening over the 30 years. What does that look like in Oregon? Here's what it looks like. Maybe you've seen this before. But what this graph shows is sort of, you can see just realizing it's Ukrainian colors. Anyhow, you can see upside down Ukrainian flag, but you can see that the shift in funding, right? So those of you who live here know, I mean, Oregon ranks 45th in the nation for student funding. When we look at a graph like this, though, part of what we need to do is realize that when you're looking at trend lines, you're looking at choices. These are not inevitabilities. These are decisions at the state, the board, and the administrative level, right? This is what this graph captures. And I think the other thing we need to think about as we look at something like this, if we're not prepared to take this on, it becomes a choice that we're making as well. So that's what I see as a non-quantitative person. That's how I understand a trend line like that. Another example of a trend line, right? And again, this is the change in student debt balance. This does not go back as far as that graph. It only goes back about 20 years. But I mean, this is stunning. Right? And I didn't even know if I wanted to include this because I couldn't decide if it was something that helps us grasp the moral problem we're facing in this country or if it's too abstract. But again, as somebody who studied the humanities, I think about these things as moral and ethical choices and not just as representations of statistical trends. And then the final one I just wanted to show you, this is actually from AAUP's recent study of the academic workforce. So what you see here is that currently over 2/3, 68%, of faculty members in U.S. colleges and universities, as of the latest data, which was fall of 21, are in appointments that are precarious, right, in non-tenurable appointments. That's compared to about 47% in fall of 1987. So you can see how all these things are happening at the same time. I don't have the numbers for PSU. My guess is this looks pretty close. I don't know. Maybe you all can tell me when we have a discussion. All right. So why did I call neoliberalism a choice rather than an inevitability? So I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is one of the things that AAUP saw in response to the Great Recession was that it was being used as a convenient excuse to restructure higher education, right? I'm not denying that the Great Recession happened. I'm not denying that there was a contraction in state funds because of the Great Recession and the effect on the economy. But what I guess I'm trying to say is that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is how come temporary blips are used to permanently restructure a public good, right? I mean, that's sort of, for me, the question. And just as a reminder, I was in Wisconsin in 2010, so I know what it looks like, what it really looks like when a state brutally takes advantage of something like this to radically restructure everything about, state services and common good. So we saw this in a response to the Great Recession, and now we're seeing it, AAUP is seeing it at a national level in response, first to the pandemic and the lockdown. I guess technically we've been declared out of it. The World Health Organization says we're done. So, we're seeing the same thing, right, with COVID and with the disruptions to enrollment. They're being used to justify further permanent institutional changes. So for me, anytime someone uses something like a once in a century pandemic and the kind of penumbra effect on enrollment from that to talk about something like we need to radically restructure our institution, we need to discontinue programs, we need to permanently lay people off, I start wondering, right? So I've included this quote because I think it just captures sort of how neoliberalism as a public pedagogy sort of defines how some people have approached this, what's happened since the pandemic. This is from our AAUP's 2021 special report on COVID. And it's, well, you can see who quotes from, it's from the president of Medaille College. His April 5th letter to the faculty. I don't know what was going on in Medaille, but like where I lived, we kind of didn't know we were in a pandemic until mid-March. So like, I feel like this guy had this ready to go. He was just waiting, right? It's like, and it's just incredible that this was his message to faculty 3 weeks into the pandemic, or 4 weeks into the pandemic. But I think it really captures, the whole never let a crisis go to waste mentality. All right, so that's the depressing part of the talk. Now we're going to move on to what do we do with all this? We know what we're against, but really, what are we for? I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. And again, to me, it's one of the really challenging parts of living through sort of this decades-long experiment in neoliberalism as a public pedagogy, is it's hard to step outside of it. It's so easy to continue to react against. It's hard to remember that we can't just react against, we have to define what we are for. And I mean, that was one of the reasons I started with 1915 was it was a time when AAUP was defining what it was for. Not only what is AAUP for, but what is higher education for? What is it for, right? So how do we talk about reclaiming the higher education, reclaiming the common good, and what do we do differently? Because I think we have to think about what we need to do now as opposed to what worked in 1915 or 1966 or maybe even 2008. And as you know, AAUP is a grassroots organization. A lot of the good ideas we have come from the ground up. And my last few slides here really draw from what I've been hearing from chapters as I travel around, and since our affiliation, what I've been hearing from our sibling unions in AFT Higher Ed. But these are sort of my thoughts about what we need to do. We must insist on workplace democracy, on processes of shared decision-making and power sharing on our campuses. Because without this level of workplace democracy for all who teach and research in higher ed, our ability to serve the common good is undermined. There's just no serving the common good if we can't engage in these discussions, right? So this, to me, is really important. I always like the inspirational quotes, so I'm sharing this one from the AAUP statement on the role of faculty in conditions of financial exigency from 2013. So this was written in response to the way that the administration's deployed kind of this crisis of the Great Recession to execute austerity, but it articulates why we need to make demands, right? And it's the reason I'm bringing it out here is because it got dusted off and worked into the 2021 COVID report that we did. And what's interesting about what happened after the Great Recession is institutions quit declaring financial exigency, right? You see, it says conditions of financial exigency, not financial exigency, which, is a condition that you're saying, bust that out. It's superfluous. No, it's not, because administrations started moving away from financial exigency, which oftentimes triggers very specific language in collective bargaining agreements or faculty handbooks about process, right? And about when the faculty get involved in the process, and starting to do things like claiming fiscal emergency or the state of exigency. They started using different kind of squishier language to basically execute the same plan, but in a way that they could kind of try to get around collective forms of faculty engagement and involvement. So this quote is an attempt to really bolster faculty governance bodies again, and really say, here's the deal, right? In shared governance, you don't involve the faculty senate, you don't involve the senate after you've already made the decision to discontinue programs or lay people off, or say, maybe our school shouldn't have a liberal arts education anymore. Maybe we should focus on gaming. That happened at a school that I will not name. It's not this one. And then ask faculty, what do you think about that? Dang, I've done shared governance. What shared governance means is that when you believe there's a fiscal or financial crisis looming, you bring people in then, and you start talking to them then, because there can be a conversation together about what should the institution prioritize. And sometimes it isn't cutting programs, it isn't cutting curriculum, it isn't laying faculty off, it isn't deciding not to admit graduate students, right? Maybe it's other things, and everybody needs to work together to figure out what those are. And the reason is not, to go back to this, it's not just because we need to do this because shared governance says we need to do it. We need to do it because shared governance is a tool in helping to ensure that higher education serves the common good. And anybody involved in the institution should be intimately, personally invested in ensuring that the institution serves the common good. So that's why this matters. And the other thing I would say about this quote is that this is, like I said earlier, this was AAUP's attempt, as we're kind of watching how the 2008 crisis is playing out, to say to faculty, you know, you got to step up here. You got to exercise your shared governance rights. We want to, you know, it's an attempt to sort of say, we're giving you the tools to fight back, because if you fight back, AAUP will have your back, right? But fighting back means fighting back. It means insisting that shared governance is followed. It means insisting that the collective bargaining agreement is followed, right? All right, so second point. We must organize and take back power in the workplace. We must stand in solidarity with all those who work at the institution, right? We're not just about, I mean, AAUP is about organizing and representing faculty. We have a pretty distinct mission, I suppose, but we also are part of a larger labor organization and part of the community here, right? So we must stand in solidarity with all of those who work at the institution. We must stand in solidarity with our students and demand that they not have to choose between an education and feeding themselves and their families. And we must stand with members of the local community and demand that the university is a responsible neighbor. So here's a really much clearer, concise articulation of what I just said. This is from Rutgers' recent contract campaign, where they really approached it. They took a couple of years, really planned this, engaged the community, engaged students, engaged other workers on campus, built what they call the beloved community. So they borrowed that. This is how they articulated that vision. And then the other thing is, we must join with allies to promote a state legislative agenda that strengthens a commitment to higher education. This is something that really speaks to one of the major reasons that AAUP decided to affiliate with the American Federation of Teachers at the national level. And it's that, you know, part of what we see with this neoliberal agenda is that it's not just a red state problem, right? There are real red state problems now. We can talk about those because we're gonna have a lot of time for discussion. The AAUP is doing a lot of work on that too, but sort of this world of neoliberalism is something that, you know, again, I just keep thinking about the public pedagogy nature of this. It's a blue state problem, it's a red state problem, right? And we play defense all the time in, you know, with GR as well. But we need to start thinking about what it looks like to play offense. We have to help our friends in the state houses understand that it's not just about saying, well, you know, we only cut funding this year. It's, well, what does real higher education and service of the common good look like, right? And we need to become more active at doing that work. And I know Oregon's a little different than other states because you all had an active state conference, and now you have this, you know, relationship with AFT Oregon. But there are other states that don't have an active state conference like we do here. So this is really one of the reasons we pursued this affiliation, and also, you know, would like to see that. And I think, you know, there's an opportunity to do that. So what would it look like to have a legislative agenda that's really why? What is common? What is a common? What would lobbying for the common good look like? I think it would include prioritizing teaching, research, and supporting student success through increased instructional budgets, but money that's earmarked for instruction, right? Not just here's a blank check, go have fun. It involves ensuring all students have access to higher education regardless of their ability to pay, right? Different states experiment with different models of this. I'm a fan of the first dollar model as opposed to the last dollar model, but you know, hey, I'll take any version of this. It's ensuring job security, equitable pay, professional voice, and sustainable careers for all faculty faculty and staff through pro-union legislation. This is something that we're seeing right now in Michigan, another state with a blue trifecta, is AFT Michigan, which now also includes the AAUP CP chapters. There are about 4,500 AAUP in part of that organization. They are this week actually actively lobbying around extending bargaining rights in the state now that they have the Democrats are in control in that state. And we've been talking a lot at the national office because we've been looking at what's happening in places like Florida, West Virginia, North Dakota, Ohio, and we're saying, what would it look like to have a pro-academic freedom legislative agenda? And one of the things we keep coming back to is that if you have a legislative agenda that serves the common good, if you create an environment, well, if you fund higher education, if you make it possible for students to afford to be there, if you make sure there are robust legislation that protects unions, right? So faculty and staff can unionize if they want to. You create an environment that is conducive to academic freedom, right? So that's part of what we've been talking about a lot at the national office is, how do you do that? And we keep coming back to this. This is what you need to do that. So. I guess that's it. I guess I wanted to end with one other thing. Go back here and make sure I cover it. Yeah, I guess I'll also just say something about Connecticut. Connecticut, another state, it's a blue state, but they're also engaged. They've had this ongoing struggle over the past 20 years of austerity budgeting. Once again, they're looking at their budgets being cut. They're looking at really radical cuts in the state higher ed system there. The faculty in Connecticut are working as part of a larger state employee coalition there called CBAC. And one of the things they're doing is they've brought in progressive faith groups and they're developing a moral budget. What would a moral budget look like for state higher education? That's something they're doing there. I think it's a really cool idea, so I wanted to share it. But it's just examples of ways that people are approaching that. And like I said, I would posit that a moral budget is also conducive to academic freedom. So really, what am I proposing here? And what do I think the role is for shared governance in all of this? I think that would be a good place to sort of wrap this up. And I guess what I would say is what I'm proposing is pretty simple, but not necessarily easy. And it's really staking out the moral high ground, engaging in true and meaningful solidarity, and asking these questions. I really think, I'm always fond of coming back to sort of guiding questions, and I've been thinking about this over the past week or so. The questions I would ask is, what does it mean to be true to the institutional mission? Who are the students we serve, and how do we best serve them? See, those are simple questions, I'm telling you. What does it mean for knowledge to serve the city? Those are the questions I think I would be asking myself if I were here right now, and sort of thinking about it as I was thinking about how do I robustly engage shared governance? How do I robustly engage academic unionism? How do I robustly work with the administration as partners? What is probably a really difficult time in some what I saw in the newspaper when I was preparing. So that's what I got for y'all. Like I said, I really wanted to kind of open up some discussion around the role of shared governance, the role of higher ed as a common good, and make sure that we had a lot of time to discuss it. So I'm going to go to my groovy little question slide. So I don't know if there are any questions. Sure.
I have more thought than a question, something that occurs to me. It always surprises me that institutions and their faculty, whether that be the faculty senate, the union won't exist, don't more often partner in going to a state legislature? Because this is largely about state legislature decisions.
Yeah.
You know, what kind of corporate tax cuts are they going to give? What kind of, here in Oregon, we have this thing called a kicker, which means we horribly forecast our economy, and so all this money we could be using has to go back to people. So I'm just, again, always surprised that administrations and faculty groups don't collectively go to it just brings a lot more pressure, and there's a lot of common interest there.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting comment. I'm going to treat it like a question, because since I've been in academia, I assume everything is actually an excuse to just talk. But yeah, so when I was at Portland State in the chapter coordinator position, which is what they called the executive director back in the day, I guess, I was, like I said, I was here from 2000 to 2003. So I was here during and after 9/11, which had an impact on the high-tech industry in the state, right? There was sort of an economic contraction post 9/11 that really impacted some of what was happening, and specifically in Portland around tech. And there were very significant budget shortfalls that year, although there was a surplus, right, of taxes that had been collected, and we all got our little kicker checks at the same time that like schools were going to close in April, and higher ed didn't know what to do, and we did lobby with the administration. So I don't know what to say about that, but there were like some big lobby days where that was back when OUS, when there was a system. And the union worked fairly strategically. I mean, obviously we didn't have 100% overlap, but we all wanted to fix some things. We all wanted more money. So there were a number of lobby days in Salem, and I remember getting on buses and going down there, and Western was there, and Southern was there, and we lobbied with the administration. We had a shared message, and the way we approached it was we were going to fight over how to implement that money once we got it, but we wanted to work together to get the money. So, I guess what I'm just saying is I agree with you. I think there's something, I think administrations and faculty unions can work together strategically with the legislature over what is perhaps a shared interest, which I hope it's a shared interest, more funding for the institution.
So,
yeah.
Honestly, Brian, the issue with the kicker is also a member education issue, and because we're still fighting for a ticket for this, and there is not much movement in the legislature for this, precisely because it is difficult for the average Oregonian to see this as a reinvestment in the greater good rather than a personal windfall. So, yeah, this is something we'll continue to fight for, and actually I just talked to Chris. I'm Victor, I'm the director of AAUP Oregon, and so we were just talking to I was just talking to our lobbyists today about what we can do in the next legislative session to try to either reform the formula so that it can be more progressive, and so that the people who need it the least don't receive the kicker, but yeah, this is a long and ongoing thing without the popular will to invest in higher, or to reinvest in higher education by foregoing the kicker. It's going to be right.
Yeah, that's politicians say, well, there isn't the political will. So do you have the political will, you individually? Well, yeah, sure I do. Okay, well, show it to us.
Right.
I mean, it takes a little courage to do this. I think there's really a deficit of courage, I think, in a lot of our elected officials.
Yeah.
Also, member education. Because we have to be getting our members to bring that pressure. Sure. Since they hear from me all the time.
Right. But I also think that gets to sort of why we need to talk about what we're for and not just what we're against. Right. We need to help them find the way forward.
So, Julie, Oscar. Go first.
Sure. So Oscar Hernandez from AUP. I'm so glad you brought these questions around how to call budgets. You know, when I talk to students about budgets, you say budgets are political tools. I like that you brought this idea that budgets are moral problems, that budgets are ethical budgets. But I love this language, even though I'm an atheist, this idea that denominational groups are thinking of budgets as moral budgets and immoral budgets.
Right.
My question to you, so thank you for that language, is how do we involve students in the common good language? For example, PSU is entertaining becoming an HSI in a couple of years, and I'm writing the recommendation report on. What examples do you have from your lens? How do we include undergrad students, grad students in the common good conversation? Because sometimes in our best conversations, we're still very faculty-driven, staff-driven, and we don't involve the students.
Right. So I think one of the challenges that we face, and it's because, I mean, I think a lot of it's because everybody's so overworked, nobody really is. There's sort of that work speed up that this becomes this sort of feedback mechanism, right? But, I think it's starting really with a couple, like say you're thinking about, we want to kind of propose a moral budget or something. It's really starting a year or two in advance and developing those relationships with the student groups on campus, whether it's like the grad union or, undergraduate student groups, and having discussions with them about what their issues are. What are their pain points, right? Especially, I mean, I don't know, maybe Portland State has changed a lot since I've been here, but, it's an urban institution. When I was here, the majority of students were first-generation students, probably many of them coming from families for whom the decision to send a kid to college was a major investment, right? And, I think the thing that's changed in 20 years, it's not that I think there weren't students who were struggling with, being unhoused or struggling with feeding themselves. That problem has gotten worse, right? It's gotten worse here, from what I've heard. It's also that's a national trend. I'm not trying to call Portland State out on that one. We see that everywhere. I think that speaks sort of to what I was showing with that graph and student debt, right? And we know from the data that the students who are most impacted by debt tend to be minority students, right? BIPOC students, Black, Latino students. And, so I think we know that, but there's how do you bring people into that conversation in a way where they feel welcome and invited to be part of the conversation. And I think it's starting with building a relationship and finding out what their struggles are. What does it mean to be a student here? What sacrifices are you making? What challenges do you have? And building out from there, right? Building out a vision, a shared vision of of what this moral budget or this common good would look like. And I think that's how when we think of some like Rutgers, who I referenced in an earlier slide, they didn't just wake up one day and say, we're going to do this. Here's our nifty little carbon slogans, right? This was years in the making. It was a very iterative, purposeful process to build those relationships and to bring in students, but also to bring in members of the larger community who live around the campus and are impacted by the campus, good, bad, or indifferent, right? So I think that's how it gets started.
Hi, my question is about how do you build into this process the flexibility that you need in order to make sure that, if we're keeping in mind a student who maybe comes from that first generation family and what they're really looking for from their education is upward economic mobility. And that's what they need from their education. How do we build in the flexibility to respond to the changes in the demands that are, and the changes in the curriculum that's necessary in order to give that student that upward mobility?
So I think there's a lot to unpack You know, I think one of the ways you do it, again, is that it's a long-term planning process. I think the mistake is to respond to blips as opposed to sort of engage, you know, when you're talking about meaningful shared governance, these are discussions that are long-term and ongoing. And again, I'm going to use the word iterative, right? Faculty, Senate, is engaged in a discussion. They're engaged again. They're engaged as part of a planning process. They're engaged in how data is collected. They're engaged in conversations about what it would look like to shift curriculum or program or add program or curriculum. And I think that's really the way to do it. I think there's also, again, I want to talk a little, I want to touch back on this logic of neoliberalism a little bit. And, when I say it's a blue state, it's a blue and red problem, right? I mean, one of the things that I think the Obama administration did that was not particularly salubrious for higher education was this scorecard stuff, and this idea that the only way to measure the success of a degree was, sort of how many people got a job, how many people are going to grad school, how many people are doing this. One of the reasons I say that is because I have 17-year-olds right now who are going around looking at colleges. Everybody's juking the damn stats, right, to make it sound better than it is. So it's like, it's kind of like a game, first of all. 98%, it's like 5 years old, okay, how come everybody's in the 98th percentile? It's like Wobegon out there at this point. So, I mean, there's that. I don't think it's a particularly useful measurement that we have because of this sort of neoliberal thinking about higher education. It's also true that we know from research that many employers are not looking for people to have just job training, right? They're looking for people who can think critically, who can understand the world, who can learn. And those are some of the skills when you talk about higher education as a common good. I mean, maybe there's soft skills, I don't know, but they're, that is part of what this is supposed to do. I mean, I think, think about 1915, think about the rapid changes that were going on in the country in the 19th century with the move from being a rural to an industrial economy. The whole education model was changing then too, right? There was this idea that we needed college because we needed, we were building a middle class. We're moving away from being agrarian to being industrial to sort of having this middle class. This is when somebody in this room wrote a book about professionalism in the 19th century and AAUP's development along with that. So I think if we think about that and think about the times we're living in, there's something there to work with, right? It's not just job training. It's not just job training. If that's all we needed, we wouldn't have the system of higher we have. And one of the things we've been talking about a lot at the national office when we've been talking about what's happening in red states and places like Florida right now is really that they're killing the goose that lays the golden egg, right? When you look at higher education in this country, which is really a global commodity, people come here to go to college and university. Right? There's something about the model we have that other people want. So I think, I just get a little nervous when we start saying really the thing we gotta be measuring is job training. It's like, yes, people go to school for upward mobility, but how that upward mobility is achieved might be not as simplistic as, my degree was in something that's very career-oriented. It's always a little more complicated.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and I also understand that we need to give students the tools to talk about how the liberal arts education they get translates into those job skills. And so, what I was wondering was how do we build that into the governance model? And how do we, make sure that we're keeping our eye on that, keeping our eye on the ball.
Like I said, I would just suggest that there's some sort of constant collegial process going on between the administration and the faculty to sort of collectively keep the eye on the ball with that one. Because I mean, my experience is not that faculty don't want to see curriculum and program change, evolve, serve the needs of the students. I mean, my experience is when they resist, it's because it's a top-down decision instead of a decision where everybody's sitting down. I know it's sort of it sounds like a cop-out answer, but it's really the one I've seen work, so. Jennifer and then Debbie.
So you mentioned Rutgers a couple of times.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why Rutgers has been so successful and it's made such a change in the way that we're thinking about academic unionism is because their union has made a very concerted effort to join with one another, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, with AAUP affiliating with AFT, with the rise of HELU, Higher Education Labor United, which actually had its launch here at Portland State a couple of weeks ago, how do we structurally, or maybe what are your insights about those places that have been most successful, and to what degree that requires the constitution of a group that is not divided by the adjuncts are in this union, the non-tenure track faculty are in this union, the staff are in this union.
So yeah, I mean, there's jurisdiction, there's what sort of a bargaining unit is defined as in law, and then there's how you act in solidarity. And, you can align bargaining, you can align bargaining areas, and you're right in that one of the things Rutgers has going for it is that they have this council of union structure that comprises a couple different bargaining units, but they have an umbrella structure. They're all represented by the same parent union, so that probably makes that easier to achieve. But that's one way of doing it. But there's just also ways of building that collaborative structure. Like I said, you can align bargaining schedules. You can have coalitional meetings. You can set up a coalitional structure. Again, I think the challenge is doing it in a way that's purposeful and long-term, right? And not just sort of, hey, we're getting ready to bargain and we want you to care about the same things we do, so hey, yeah. But, yeah, I mean, that's one way of doing it. Debbie.
Someone had a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
How does shared governance interface with early childhood education field? That was her question. I'm going to just add a little PS to that. You mentioned Florida several times, and we don't tend to think about shared governance and academic freedom in early, pre-K, early childhood, K-12. But some of the most vicious attacks we're seeing, of course, are at those lower levels. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on the concept of shared governance in the lower levels of education.
That's way outside of my area of expertise. They need it. I mean, the thing they have in a place like Florida, right, is they have a very robust union, which is a joint AFT-NEA union, Florida Education Association. So, I mean, when I talk about unions, earlier I talked about unions and shared governance kind of growing up together in higher education. Unionization in some ways is just another way of expressing shared governance, right? It's another way of having a structure through which to engage collaboratively. The challenges in Florida are ones that really stem from political decisions, right? Elections at the state level have consequences, and elections everywhere have consequences, but I'm not sure what a shared governance model would look like in early education, but in Florida, they need something, because I mean, the attacks there are authoritative. What we're talking about there is something completely beyond the scope of, neoliberalism is bad, right? It's about authoritarianism. It really is.
So I thank you, Julie. I want to get a little bit more brass tacks with what we're experiencing here at PSU. I see and know a lot in my role. So one of the things that you may not have known is that the university in its accreditation report got a ding based on the uncollaborative process with its budgeting and faculty summit. We are also seeing a complete an administration that's completely ignoring shared governance when it comes to engaging with the university campus and public safety committee, when it comes to policing practices. We are seeing a university administration that isn't engaging with any feedback about dropping policies for health and safety, such as the COVID-19 vaccine policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in my time as the president of PSU-AAUP, I will say that the past year, since May 1st, I have seen what I consider a very, very, it's not an erosion of shared governance, it's a landslide for PSU. And so I'm very concerned in the context of PSU and then Oregon and then nationally, when you bring in the things that we're seeing in Florida, et cetera, and it's happening in Oregon, that legislation is being introduced in Oregon.
Right.
It's just not passing.
Right.
The book challenges, they're happening in Oregon, and they're going through. It's in the K-12 system, and it's in libraries, and it's a librarian, and I care very much about that. Right. But I guess my question to you is, we're at the bottom of a landslide right now with shared governance at PSU, and we're welcoming a new president. Do you have any practical advice or steps, things that we can do to kind of take this giant landslide and put it back up and paste it with like, I don't know, Bondo or something to the side of the cliff. And at the same time, understanding that I really appreciate what you're talking about moral budgets and then academic freedom and shared governance being tied together. So I guess I was thinking about brass tacks, PSU, we got a lot going on. It's been a really bonkers year. Never thought I'd be dealing with this stuff as president. And so, yeah, what's your advice for us in this room?
Yeah, so I'm fighting my instinct, which is to be cynical about presidents. So I'm going to fight that instinct and say a new president is an opportunity to try to reset the relationship, right? That doesn't mean to be naive about it, but it's an opportunity to strategically reset the relationship. And it's a way, I think it's an opportunity to test that individual. I don't know what, she said, if she met with faculty when she was here and what she said about shared governance. I do hope faculty were involved in the search. If they weren't, that's a no-no. That's a violation of shared governance. But I think there's an opportunity to say, we have a long history of shared governance here. I mean, it's enshrined in the contract. It was, that was one of the things this institution enshrined in the contract from the jump, right? It's been there forever. So there's obviously something here that both the faculty and the administration decided was important, because a collective bargaining agreement is an agreement between two parties, right? It's not just like the union's wish fulfillment of how we operate. So the fact that shared governance is enshrined in the contract tells me that at various points in the history of the relationship between the faculty and the administration, both parties have seen that this was something they wanted to remain committed to. And I mean, I would see an opportunity with a new president to sit down and talk about that and to articulate some of what you've articulated. I would think it would be maybe the union and the Senate leadership meeting with the president together. I mean, that's a brass tacks thing. You all know what makes most sense here. But and I think I would try to reset the relationship. And give her the opportunity to rise to the occasion. But like I said, I'm ultimately cynical about some of that stuff, so I wouldn't give her too long of a honeymoon period with it, I guess. You know, and I guess, again, you know, maybe it's worthwhile to be a little optimistic. So I'm thinking again about the COVID report that AAUP came out with in 2021, and the University of Akron, there was some really bad stuff that went down there, right? That was, you know, the university declared force majeure and just used it to basically do what they had been doing before anyhow, what they tried to do before, and the union had stopped them from doing. They did it. And I'm not lying, it was literally to get rid of liberal arts to teach gaming. Like, gaming like the stuff my kids do, that kind of thing. They laid off a bunch of tenured faculty, hired them back as adjuncts. It was a mess, right? And there was an administration turnover. Also a place where there was a search with no involvement. And there was really an opportunity. I think it was bad enough that everybody stepped away from the abyss. And one of the things that has happened is that the administration and the union and the faculty senate are engaging each other again. And we've actually sent, you know, since we did this investigation, we've sent a visitor back a few times via Zoom, because we can do that now. And you know what's been reported to us is that yeah, it's actually improved. But that was something they actually worked at. I sound like I'm talking about therapy, but it's something they worked at and they were able to change. But yeah, I would use the opportunity of the new president coming in to try to establish that.
Yeah, and Emily, I think, touched on it, but I think I'll touch on it even more. Sometimes what happens at PSU, and I've been here since 2003, is that the same administration and faculty senate are doing shared governance. It's performative. So my question to you is, you said you like guiding questions. Can you give us some guiding questions to ask those moments where I feel, you know, the shared governance that we're discussing is really performative. I really want to cut through the bull crap, really get to whether this is actually shared governance or this is a performance for both parties, you know, PSU, Senate, and administration.
So I don't know if it's so much guiding questions as what to look for. I mean, again, I'm just going to use kind of this model of like budgets and cuts because it's something we've seen at other institutions. And what we talked about it a lot in our 2013 report, in our Katrina report after the hurricane, and sort of this disaster capitalism model, right? Is, you know, if the approach to shared governance is, so I guess we could phrase this as a question. Well, if the approach to shared governance is one where there's already a predetermined playing field, right? Like we need to we have a budget shortfall, so we need to cut programs, we need to cut classes. I would say that is not meaningful shared governance. Because under, you know, if you go to AAUP's 1966 statement, if you go to this 2013 report I've talked about, if you look at what's called our RIRs, which are recommended institutional regulations, you will find that how it is supposed to work. If you look at AAUP's language on financial exigency, right, not just on the state of fiscal emergency or whatever we call it now, but actual financial exigency language. The way it works when there is true and meaningful shared governance is that faculty are, through the shared governance body, are engaged at the beginning of the process, not when the decision is already like, therefore we must get rid of programs, or therefore we must lay people off. They're engaged at the beginning of the process. So I guess one question is, when are we being brought into the process? Have decisions already been made, right? Is there sort of a predetermined narrative we're working through? A second question is, are they sharing all the data with us, right? Have we, do we, and that, sometimes they are. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Do we have access to all of the information we need access to? Are they sharing it? Do we have to, FOIA them? Do we have to bring in Howard Bunces to ferret it out for us, or are they sharing it, right? So that's another question, a series of questions, I suppose. I think another question, one of the things we've seen a lot of over in my time in the past decade at AAUP is administration saying, yeah, we're engaging in shared governance. We have this hand-picked group of faculty who we talk to, who tell us how they feel about things, who we run ideas by. It's a special committee we put together, blah, blah, blah. So that's shared governance. No, shared governance is working through the Senate, which is composed of people elected by their colleagues to serve their role. So I guess the question would be like, is there a special rump parliament that has been set up, or is it actually going through a bona fide Senate body, right? Because most Senates have budget committees or have committees to look at curriculum. So if they're like, well, we have a special group we set up to do it, ding, shared governance. No. So that's another question. Are we actually working through the shared governance body that's composed of the people who were elected by their colleagues? So I guess those are 3 questions for you. Other questions? Okay, I see 2, and I see a Western person, but we'll start here. I'm an introvert.
My name is Iris. I work in academic affairs here, specifically in the Learning Center. But it's so interesting just like hearing this, because like I think the example that you gave about the university, and specifically that administrator at the university, where April 2020 immediately had something ready, right, to say,
Isn't
okay,
that weird?
right,
Like that's what he sent us.
It was no doubt probably ready, right? And it was like, this is the perfect moment, I'm gonna capitalize on this. And that's the climate that we're in. And when we talk about blue states, red states, I mean, we're a red state. We happen to have some blue pockets, and we're a slightly bigger blue pocket, but like people are knocking at that door. And I guess knowing that even like the middle, even what we call the left, has moved so far to the right, where we stand now in this country, and knowing that like the right thinks in terms of like decades, and the left is more famous for, really being quite reactionary and being good at mobilizing, but not as good at organizing sustainably. It's more of an observation, but I'm like, how do we do this? Like, it's like we're in an ocean, and we're being like, how do we make our 3 cubic feet of that ocean entirely different from the rest of the ocean? And it feels like that's what this conversation is saying. I mean, like, the drumbeat is there, and the power brokers in this conversation that we're all in this room talking about, our CEO is like probably the wealthiest person in the state of Oregon, but went all in on trying to get a Trump supporter, a Trump wannabe elected governor, and was really frighteningly close to that. And so, I don't know, it's gonna take something bigger. And when we talk about, like, oh, there's agreements that there's been an agreement at Portland State University for shared governance for so long, and like to talk about that, like we think that they have to respect that, when like the legal scholar Dean Spade has written about, there's the law and there's the application of the law, right? Who actually ever gets dinged for jaywalking, right? Or for a taillight out?
Right.
It's only certain people,
Right.
And so, like, unless there are very real teeth and consequences to these things, and so it comes back to courage in a way, right? That term came up. I mean, there has to be pain, is what's going to be the only thing that's really going to make this stuff actually happen, right? I mean, especially in this environment.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's like it's great to have this conversation. And also, I'm just like, things are grim, and there is this movement toward professionalization and licensure, and like how much is this going to make me money, or at least that's what we're telling people they should think, instead of this idea that like the liberal education is like desperately needed more than ever in the United States if we're going to survive as a democracy.
Yeah.
So, you know, those are just some thoughts on this, but I just think, I'm like, how do we put teeth behind this, right? And it can't happen on a campus by campus basis. Like, I'd love to see a lot more inter-campus organizing.
Yes.
You know, and then we put teeth in it at the regional level in a way that we inflict pain, you know, in a meaningful way.
Right.
I mean, that's the only way that I see this ever succeeding, because they're really good at deploying pressure release valves in the form of committees and stuff, like extremely good at that. Portland State is particularly adept. Oh, we'll call a committee. Let's have a bunch of free labor for 3 years, and then we'll just either never do anything or we'll just reverse everything at the end of that period of time. That's just real. And so, anyway, those are I just wanted a little sunshine at the end of the session.
I was gonna say, you're more depressing than I am. I thought I was depressing.
I'm
Compared to
scorpion.
you, I'm back at Sunnybrook Farm. Yeah, so we have to be optimists of the will, right? We have to be realistic about the situation we find ourselves in, the context we find ourselves in, but we have to be willing to fight for something better. Because if you don't, that way is Florida, right? I mean, what you're saying is, you know, Oregon doesn't look that different than Michigan, right? As far as elections go. You know, again, like I still am recovering from Wisconsin. Literally, I've only been back there twice, and every time I go, it's like painful. Because to see the birth of the public sector union movement in this country, right? AFSCME was born, we know that. AFSCME was born in Madison. To see what has happened to that state. And I think, you know, part of it is like, we just have to decide we're not going to give in, because we know history has taught us the consequences of giving into it, and we have to appeal to other people to come with us. And I think we also have to be realistic about the fact it's not a 1-year project, a 2-year project, a 3-year project. You're right. The right has been very dogged in their commitment to, like, over decades building for the moment we find ourselves in now, in all sorts of ways when you look at individual rights. I think the other thing is that we, you know, maybe I didn't really talk about it enough, but part of what, you know, sort of threaded throughout some of what we were looking at earlier with my presentation is there's really no individual rights that aren't really embedded in collective rights. And I think that we forget that sometimes as a culture, that individual rights are always bolstered. They grow out of and are bolstered by collective endeavors, collective bodies, right? And we, you know, I've thought about that a lot with the AAUP and sort of the move to really engaging in individual harms as opposed to harms to the collective. You know, I think one of the challenges is if you focus on something like the abrogation of an individual's academic freedom or the abrogation of an individual's, you know, employment relationship vis-a-vis tenure, you're missing oftentimes the big picture, which is this is just a tiny, you know, little acorn in a forest of attacks on the whole, right? And I think we need to figure out how we engage on that issue, not just among ourselves, but with some of these other communities, you know, students, right? Other people we've talked about. Like, why should it matter to a student if the faculty doesn't have, you know, the faculty as a collective don't have academic freedom. They can't teach what they are trained to teach and what they're experts in. Ask the students at the new college in Florida how they feel about that question now, right? So, I mean, I think we have to think about how do we start sort of bringing people into that conversation, but realize it's not going to be an overnight success. And I think I agree with you. We tend to get distracted, but we can't. We can't.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Melanie, I'm the president for Western Oregon University, so I'm a guest. But you had some really great insights. We've been through a lot of what you talked about. We brought in Howard Bunsen, so we did all of those things with an administration that shared governance was completely eroded, and so was our campus morale. We have a new president. We used it as an invitation to make a better relationship and things that are going better. But what we found is that due to that sort of destruction of morale and people being overloaded, is that any of our big conversations are still really maneuvered through our union, and it doesn't take place in, even though we're a part of shared governance, it doesn't take place in our faculty senate. So our faculty senate has basically just been convened, just talks about curriculum and not other things. So my question is if you have examples of how of universities where people maybe have worked together in the union and the senate to re-empower their senators, because the power is there. And in fact, even my president has complained to me and said, I'm waiting for your faculty to take their power back. They're not doing this. Whoa. And I'm like, okay. But it's not really like, what for me as the union, my goal is to just really get our salaries raised. I don't want to fight every battle because we have these places, not because they couldn't. But I think it would take away from them eventually the power that they should have. So do you have examples of places where people have re-empowered their faculty senate, or the union and senates have worked together to sort of distribute that power and take it back successfully?
Yeah, trying to think. So examples of how it works. I was trying to see, I thought there was somebody here who had that experience on his campus, but I couldn't see it for. One of the ways I've seen it work. Well, I can give you an example from a non-unionized campus that also has an AFT local 3535 in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. What they did when they were facing some challenges around attacks on shared governance and really an attempt to neuter the Senate was that that's a non-bargaining local, it's an AFT local, and they also have an AAUP chapter on campus, because why not have every alphabet letter? I guess it's just a bunch of A's and T, but anyhow, they decided to basically run specific people to serve on the Senate who understood the power that the Senate could have and worked closely with the union. Yeah, they basically, took, I mean, I don't want to say took the Senate over because they're faculty and it's not really taking it over, but they specifically ran people for Senate who were going to, who understood the power that they had, even in a reduced, kind of decimated environment like the UW system, and were willing to use it.
That's a great. We've done that here quite a bit over the years.
Yeah. And we sort of fell into places because all of our faculty or union members were small, really small compared to all of you. And so I think people think that they've done both, but that helps a lot to think about strategic.
My name is Evgenia, and I'm originally from Eastern Europe, so I grew up in a collectivist society. So I was very pleased to see your subtitle, Reclaiming the Common Good, because I very rarely hear the concept of the common good here in this country. And I was wondering, I assume very often that people don't use it because they don't even know what it means. So how do you actually spread the concept? Because it is a common concept for shared governance, but I don't know, it's kind of, I very rarely hear that.
Right. So, I mean, first of all, I think we reintroduce it back into the vocabulary, right? And we talk about things that are everyday things that are examples of a common good. I mean, we're at one of them right now, right? The university. I mean, this is a shared, especially public institutions are a common good. They are literally a common investment, right? A common wealth. K-12 education in this country is a common good, right? That's one of the reasons, you know, and I kind of thinking about the early ed question. The tax, right? There's a tax in higher ed, and then there's the ways that these attacks look at K-12, which is really the privatization and charter movement, right? And you know, but reminding people like what K-12 education really is. It's all of us saying we think it's important for people to have access to basic education in this country, so we pay taxes for that. We do that because we think it's important. We don't want it, you know, being done solely by private entities, right? Roads. You like driving on a road? That's a common good. You like that streetcar down there? Common good, right? I think sometimes we forget what these things are. Basically, the things that make our lives better. So I don't know, like sometimes for me, it's like identifying what a common good is, right? And I was really surprised, again, you know, when I was in Wisconsin, the things that people didn't understand were common goods, but when you polled them on it, they really cared about it. They just didn't understand they were common goods, right? Or public goods. And so I think kind of making that connection for people is really important. Like in a very, you know, discrete way. This thing here is a common good, right? Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
If I can take a point of personal privilege, something like it for 50 years. I'd like to throw a comment out to Iris's comments. I was trained as an educational historian, so I tend to think in views of 20 to 100 years, right? So I'm a big picture thinker. And sometimes I've had a hard time actually getting down to really discrete data. So I think, especially in this world, we have the communications options that we do. So if I really wanted to spend hours drowning in the authoritarian, if not fascist state that Florida is right now, I can't. But I'm not in Florida. I'm right here.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to become overwhelmed with all the things we see, right? It feels like we're drowning in it. But if you go to that old sort of trite saying that, well, what did you do in the war?
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you are is your battlefield.
Yep.
We can't fix what's going on in Florida, but we can work on this piece. That's our little part. That's our contribution. And that's actually all we can do, right? Because I can't be in Florida and in India and in Russia and in the Ukraine. I can only be here. So my work in this larger epic battle that we're in is great.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And, you know, I think that's what I was trying to signal with Michigan, is that's a place, you know, we have examples other places, right, where they're sort of saying, here's how we're pulling ourselves out of the mess. These are examples, these are object lessons, right? And Oregon can be an object lesson, because someday in Florida, somebody's gonna say like, damn, that's just too much. We have to change, you know, we've now gone too far, right? And at least I hope so. You know, that's changing things here, improving things here, shifts the dynamic somewhere else, right? Because I think what you've been pointing out is that sort of as it gets worse and more authoritarian other places, it kind of pulls us that direction, pull it back. I think what Deb's saying is pull it back, right? And so is that a good place to end? Because I actually did a little dance move there.